All right. So thank you everyone for joining today. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Emily Tan, and I will be your webinar host today. So let's see what we have in store. Before we begin, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items so everyone is aware of how this webinar will be organized. As this is a virtual event with hundreds of attendees listening in, your camera and microphone are automatically muted. The speakers will be presenting in English, but we will have live interpretation in Bahasa Indonesia and Mandarin. You can listen in on your preferred channel by selecting the right language channel at the bottom of your screen. You should see the menu when you move your cursor towards the lower part of your Zoom window. This session is recorded and the slides will be shared with everyone who registered. The recording will also be published on the SPTI YouTube channel. And last but not least, we have requested for questions to be sent ahead for our speakers. So some FAQs will be covered during the session, and the Q&A feature will not be turned on. This is also to ensure that we have the best live interpretation experience for those listening in to Mandarin and Bahasa Indonesia. We will be hearing from these speakers today. And once again, my name is Emily Tan, and I am part of CDP's Transition Accelerator team, working closely with the SBTi. I'd like to also introduce Teresa Bicalo, who leads the work on agriculture, forestry, and land use sector. And Teresa is supported by her project officer, Lucine Cortadon. They're both part of the sector development team at the SBTi. Today's guest speaker is Matt Ramlo, Research Associate at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And last but not least, my teammate, Dedi Mahardika, SBT Engagement Manager for Southeast Asia and Oceania, will also be presenting some case studies as well. I also want to thank those working behind the scenes on this webinar and on this project, as well as the other two sessions in Portuguese and Spanish. So we will start today with a recap of the SBTi FLAG and Greenhouse Gas Protocol land sector guidance, and then an update from Matt on the land sector guidance itself, followed by an overview of the SBTi FLAG target setting requirements and target setting process, and finally some case studies to put things in practical context. For those who are not familiar, I'd like to give a quick introduction to the SBTi, or Science-Based Targets Initiative. The SBTi was founded just before the Paris Agreement as a collaboration between 4 founding partner organizations, CDP, UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, and the World Wildlife Fund, in collaboration with Women Business Coalition. The SBTi drives ambitious corporate climate action by enabling companies and financial institutions to set emissions reduction targets which are based on science and in alignment with goals of the Paris Agreement. And since then, SBTs have become, or science-based targets have become the gold standard of climate target setting. And stakeholders, including investors, policymakers, regulators, and customers, are increasingly expecting companies to have these kind of robust targets in place in order to future-proof their business for the low-carbon transition. We are seeing a huge uptake from companies who have joined the SBTi, and the demand is gaining momentum each month. As of now, we have over 5,000 companies represented, with close to 3,000 companies with validated targets and 270 companies validated for net zero. Globally speaking, many of the companies joining SBTi have come from Europe, but we see a healthy proportion of companies coming from Asia as well. Within Asia, most of the companies are headquartered in East Asia, with Japan, China, and India leading the region, making up majority of the companies. So we're hoping to see more companies from other parts of the region, coming on board. And the SBTi has also a series of guidance for these 14 high-impact sectors in various stages of development. Together, they represent 90% of global emissions, and the FLAG sector alone accounts for a huge proportion of these emissions. And now I will let my colleague Teresa to provide a recap to set the context for today's main topic. Teresa, please.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. I'm Teresa Bicalo, a follow lead of the SPTI. Thanks for having me and my colleagues in this session to speak about the SPTI Forest, Land and Agricultural Guidance. In this part of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the link between the SPTI FLAG guidance and the greenhouse gas protocol and sector guidance. I will explain why they are needed and provide an overview of the complementarities and alignment. Next slide, please. Let's start by highlighting the importance of these two standards. As you can see in the graphic on the left, the FLAG sector represents nearly a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions, being one of the largest emitters after energy. These emissions have not been covered by corporate inventories nor target setting before, as there were no standard methods or guidance for that until now. The impact of these emissions is even more relevant if we think from the perspective of land-intensive sectors. For example, around 70 to 80% of greenhouse emissions from companies in land-intensive sectors, such as the food sector, come from the use of land. However, few account for these emissions or include them in the climate targets. This is why the SBTi FLAG guidance and the greenhouse gas protocol and sector guidance are so important to fill this gap for the corporate sector, making sure that land emissions are covered. This includes emissions from land conversion and agricultural systems and land removals, which makes the land sector so unique in terms of greenhouse gas accounting and target setting compared to other sectors. My colleagues will speak more specifically about land emissions and removals later in this presentation. Next slide. So, companies now have new guidance to comprehensively account for their land sector emissions and to include these emissions in the climate targets. Last year, the greenhouse gas protocol team launched the draft of the land sector and removals guidance, which explains how companies should account for and report greenhouse gas emissions and removals from the land sector. This is the standard you should follow when your company has land intensity activities in its value chain in order to build a correct greenhouse gas inventory. The SBTi Forest, Land and Agricultural Guidance, on the other hand, is a standard guidance for science-based target setting, which includes land-based emissions and removals. The SBTi FLAG guidance indicates how much and how quickly a company needs to reduce in land-related emissions, its land-related emissions, to keep the global the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. Something that I also want to highlight is that during the development process of the FLAG guidance, the FLAG team worked together with the greenhouse gas protocol team, and we continue working together to coordinate alignment as the final greenhouse gas protocol guidance is still being finalized. Next slide. In this chart, you can see milestones periods of these two projects. In January last year, we conducted a 2-month public consultation process of the draft version of the SBTi FLAG guidance. And last September, we launched the final guidance. At the same time, in September 2022, the draft version of the greenhouse gas protocol and sector guidance was also launched, and its final version is expected to be released in mid-2024. Companies have then these two guidance available, the greenhouse gas protocol and land sector guidance in draft version, and the SBTi FLAG guidance. Last November, after the launch of the SBTi FLAG guidance, we initiated the pre-validation process for FLAG target setting in the SBTi. And in May this year, we officially opened the target validation process. So in terms of timelines to set FLAG targets, FLAG is now mandatory for companies setting science-based targets for the first time. These companies will be using the draft version of the GHG protocol and sector guidance until the final version is released. The timelines for setting FLAG targets are slightly different for companies with validated SBTi targets. Companies with validated science-based targets that are required to set a FLAG target must recalculate the energy industry target to include a FLAG target within 6 months after the release of the final version of the greenhouse gas protocol and sector guidance. Next slide. Let's now address 2 frequently asked questions about timelines to set FLAG targets and about the use of the draft version of the greenhouse gas protocol land sector guidance. The first question is, my company will set a net zero target this year. Can we wait until end 2024 to set a FLAG target? The answer to this is no. Since May this year, when we launched the validation process, companies that meet the relevant FLAG criteria and wish to set net zero targets are required to include FLAG near-term targets. Let's go to the second question. If my company sets a FLAG target this year, should the FLAG target be recalculated once the final greenhouse gas protocol and sector guidance is released? No, this is not needed. Companies using the draft version of the greenhouse gas protocol and sector guidance can follow the SBTi regular target update cycle. With this, I will hand over to Emily to take us to the next piece. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa. And now we will hear from Matt Ramlo, Research Associate at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, who will provide us a status update on the land sector and removals guidance. As Matt is unable to present live for this session, this portion will be played from a pre-recorded video. Thank you.
Hi there, thanks for having me join for this session today. My name is Matt Ramlo, and I'm with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, leading the development of our new land sector and removals guidance, which I wanted to share with you today. So as was shared earlier in the presentation, the purpose of this guidance is to support companies who are developing land sector greenhouse gas inventories on the accounting guidance, methods, and data. This guidance is building on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's corporate standard and corporate value chain, or Scope 3 standard, to provide clarity on how companies in land sector value chains account for emissions across Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Similar to the SPTI FLAG guidance, this guidance is intended for companies in agricultural, forestry, or other land-based value chains. So that includes both those companies that own or control land and produce goods on the land, but also companies further downstream that source from them. However, in addition to the FLAG guidance, we also provide guidance on technological CO2 removals, such as processes like direct air capture and storage within geologic carbon pools, which is addressed in other aspects of SBTi. And finally, the scope of this guidance does include both emissions and removals across scopes 1, 2, and 3, and how to account for greenhouse gas emissions from land use change, land-based activities, and CO2 removals in their storage. So over the course of the presentation, we wanted to kind of walk through our new land sector activities. So here you can see figure 4.1 from our draft guidance that's showing the biogenic carbon cycle. And in this presentation, we're going to cover our definitions for CO2 removals, that remove CO2 from the atmosphere, which is provided in Chapter 6 of the guidance, our guidance on land use change, which is provided in Chapter 7 of the guidance on greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 removals associated with land management in Chapter 8 of our guidance. This gets at definitions that we have for land-based carbon pools, which you can find in Chapter 4 and Chapter 8. Once those carbon pools on the land are harvested and made into products such as timber, we cover that in Chapter 4 and Chapter 9 of our guidance of storing products and carbon in products. And then finally, any emissions from those biogenic products that are emitted, we provide guidance in Chapter 9. So starting with our guidance on CO2 removals, in this land sector and removals guidance, we define a removal as a process that includes two distinct elements. The first is the transfer of greenhouse gases, namely carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere via sinks, which are the process that remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and the storage of that carbon or CO2 within carbon pools, which is the reservoir or medium where the carbon is stored. So as you can see from the figure on the right, there's two different definitions for removals. One would be the gross removal. So that is just the sink process where CO2 is removed from the atmosphere, so the down arrow. But our guidance is built around the concept of what we call net removals, which is the CO2 not only removed from the atmosphere, but that is transferred to storage in a carbon pool. So removals that are referred to in our guidance really look at that net sequestration piece in addition to the sink process, and where we are only referring to the one-way transfer, we refer to that as gross removals, this will come up later in some of the other slides. And since CO2 removals were not previously included within Scope 1 or Scope 3 of the corporate standard, this guidance is introducing new draft requirements that companies should follow in order to ensure the higher level principles of ensuring permanence of CO2 and its storage, as well as conservativeness when reporting on CO2 removals. So within our latest draft, we have 5 requirements for CO2 removals. This includes ongoing monitoring, so the need to continue to monitor carbon pools where CO2 removals are sequestered over time, traceability, which requires knowledge of the pools where carbon is stored within a company's value chain and understanding where that comes from. 3 is primary data, that companies looking to report removals need to have primary data relevant to the supply chains or value chains that they source from. 4, uncertainty, which would require companies to produce quantitative estimates of uncertainty on the removal values and ensure that the removal estimates are statistically significant. And then finally, 5, that as they continue to monitor the carbon pools that have removed CO2, they would need to account for reversals in their reporting as well. You can find additional details on these draft requirements in Chapter 6, Section 6.2 of our draft guidance. The next category we wanted to talk about is how to account for land use change. So our guidance in Chapter 4 and Chapter 7 clarifies the different land uses that Greenhouse Gas Protocol recognizes, which builds on the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, IPCC's 6 categories of forest lands, grasslands, croplands, wetlands, settlements or infrastructure, and other lands. Land use change is represented by a change from one land use to another, or it can also be lands remaining within the same category, but changing from one land use subcategory to another. So an example of this would be conversion of natural or primary forests to plantation forestry. In our guidance, we require companies to account for land use change emissions, and they can use different metrics depending on the level of traceability they have to the purchased goods and services they source. So where they know the farm or land management unit that they're sourcing from, they can quantify direct land use change associated with any emissions from carbon stock losses on those lands in the previous 20 years or greater. So an example of this would be conversion of forests to a cocoa plantation. They would need to look back 20 years and account for any carbon stock losses as emissions through direct land use change. Where companies may only have traceability to a country of origin, they can use statistical land use change metrics. So these are emission factors that are often reported in life cycle databases that look at all of the land use change occurring within a jurisdiction and then allocate it to different products from that jurisdiction. So this is available for companies that might not have that full traceability to the individual farms. You can find more guidance on this in Chapter 7 of our draft guidance. In addition to quantifying the impacts that the land use change impacts that companies have within their own value chains, the guidance also recognizes that purchased goods and services can potentially increase land use change on land outside of a company's inventory boundaries or value chain. So in order to track some of these systemic global impacts, companies are required to choose at least one of the metrics to report on according to our draft guidance. The three metrics that are included in the draft guidance are indirect land use change, carbon opportunity costs, or land occupation. And I would point you to Chapter 7 of our draft guidance to learn more about these different metrics. In addition to quantifying emissions associated with land use change, we also require companies to quantify the emissions associated with land management. Land management, we break into two different types of greenhouse gas emissions. On the left-hand side, you can see our definitions for land management net CO2 removals or emissions. So this is really looking at the management practices on lands that remain in the same land use. So forests that remain as forest, or croplands that remain as croplands, and all the various activities including here, such as harvesting and forest rotation periods, replanting, species selection, fire management, site preparation, crop tillage and residue management, crop rotations or intercropping, soil amendments, and conservation buffers and set-aside lands, and how these different management activities can increase or decrease the net carbon stock change on that land over time. Companies should use the net carbon stock change to report net CO2 removals or emissions, where removals are associated with net carbon stock increases and emissions are associated with net carbon stock decreases. You can also see on the right-hand side of this figure that we include land management non-CO2 emissions. So these are emissions from nitrous oxide and methane. You can see in the figure here, this includes greenhouse gas emissions from biomass burning, enteric fermentation, manure management, managed soils, application of lime or urea, rice cultivation, and reservoirs. For more guidance on accounting for land management emissions, you can look at Chapter 8 of our draft guidance. When we talk about quantifying the carbon stock change within land-based carbon pools, this figure outlines the different land-based carbon pools that are recognized by the guidance, which is carbon in terrestrial biomass, dead organic matter, and soil carbon pools. You can see that the biomass carbon pool includes both above ground biomass and below ground biomass. The dead organic matter carbon pool includes carbon stored in deadwood and litter. And finally, for carbon that's stored in the soil, we define this as the soil organic matter, which is less than 2 millimeters in diameter based on common definitions for soil carbon that are used more broadly. For more guidance on the definitions for the different carbon pools, you can find that in Chapter 4 of our draft guidance. As I mentioned before, after different products are produced on the land, they are then harvested and become raw products such as logs or other agricultural goods, which can then be refined or processed into semi-finished or intermediate products, and at the end, final products through processing and manufacturing in the value chain. We recognize that some of these products, such as forest products, may lead to longer-term storage of carbon within those products. And in Chapter 9 of our guidance, we provide detail on how you would account for those changes in carbon stocks within product carbon pools, such as harvested wood products. For other types of biogenic products, such as crops like soy or maize, these often would not lead to long-term storage and are either returned to the atmosphere through consumption as food or feed, or through combustion of bioenergy products. The next slide will show how we would account for those associated biogenic CO2 emissions from the products where they're not stored. And again, you can find more guidance in Chapter 9 of our draft guidance. So getting to the final piece that I wanted to cover today around biogenic CO2 emissions. Biogenic CO2 is reported based on the net biogenic CO2 flux, where companies would look to the land that the biogenic products are sourced from to account for that net land carbon stock change, as I mentioned in the earlier land management slide. Since that net carbon stock change is reported in the scope, either scope 1 or scope 3, depending on the reporting company, the gross biogenic emissions are separately reported for transparency. So you can see from the diagram, as I mentioned on the removal slide at the beginning, the one-way transfer of CO2 to biomass carbon pools could be reported separately as gross biogenic land CO2 removals. And when that is eventually emitted back to the atmosphere, so after the maize grows, is harvested, and then is combusted back to the atmosphere, either as a biofuel or through food or feed consumption, that would go back to the atmosphere and reported as gross biogenic product CO2 emissions. The net carbon stock change, according to our draft guidance, is what would be reported in the land management net CO2 emissions or removals pool. The final note that I will make is that this works for the carbon cycle associated with CO2 emissions, but for methane emissions or nitrous oxide emissions associated with biogenic products, there is not a gross CO2 removal to counterbalance the CO2 emission. So methane and nitrous oxide are required to be reported as emissions, non-land, in the relevant scope. And this is in following with the current guidance within our corporate standard and scope 3 standard. I wanted to conclude with a few frequently asked questions that we get on the development process for our land sector and removals guidance. So the first question is, how can I account for emissions when data is not available or we don't have the resources to collect it? So in our guidance, in our calculation guidance chapters, we do provide references to the IPCC emission factors that are provided for national greenhouse gas inventories. That does provide some default or tier 1 data that companies could utilize in order to estimate some of their impacts. Our team has also identified some other databases and calculation resources that companies could pursue if they're interested in finding more refined emission factors. The next question is, how can companies get engaged with Greenhouse Gas Protocol on further standard development? So here I would like to refer to our Greenhouse Gas Protocol newsletter and future updates process that you can go to our website at greenhousegasprotocol.org to find more information and to subscribe to our newsletter to get updates on these future processes. So thank you for your time, and I hope you found this to be helpful and clarifying, and feel free to reach out to our team if you have any additional questions. Thanks. Hi there.
That was Matt Ramlo from Greenhouse Gas Protocol. All right. So the following section, we will now look at the main requirements and features of the SBTi flag guidance. And Lucine will be presenting this section. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone attending this presentation today. I will now take you to this next section. So what are the key features and requirements of FLAG to keep in mind? Next slide, please. So first of all, FLAG covers land emissions and biogenic removals. So in that sense, FLAG targets will be separate from energy industry targets. FLAG will offer options for both demand-side and supply-side companies. The guidance includes a sector approach, which is the best option for companies on the demand side, and a commodity approach, which covers 11 major commodities with significant carbon footprints. These commodities are beef, chicken, dairy, leather, maize, palm oil, pork, rice, soy, wheat, and timber and wood fiber. FLAG will also require a no deforestation commitment no later than by 2025. FLAG does not include offsets. And finally, FLAG designated sectors or an emission threshold will indicate which companies are required to set FLAG targets. We'll now dive into more details for each of these points. Next slide, please. Let's start with this first key feature. What does FLAG cover? There are three key areas for land-intensive sectors that were not covered in non-FLAG targets, also known as energy industry science-based targets, that are now covered by the SPTi FLAG guidance. These are land use change, land management, and carbon removals. Land use change represents 11% of global emissions and half of the land sector emissions. This is why the FLAG models includes all land use change emissions, including deforestation, forest degradation, and conversions of all types of natural ecosystems. The second set of emissions covered by SBTi's FLAG guidance is land management. Land management concerns all the activities that occurs on farms and in planted forests related to the production of agricultural commodities. And the third one is carbon removals. Because plants and soils sequester carbon naturally, land removals are also covered by FLAG. The activities here will include forest restoration, silvopasture, improved forest management, agroforestry, soil organic carbon, and biochar. It's important to note that product carbon pools are not considered as removals under FLAG. It's also important to understand that land carbon removals included in FLAG are not offsets, because again, offsets are not included in FLAG. Only emission reduction and land-based removals occurring on working lands in a company's supply chain can contribute to FLAG targets. These removals cannot be included in or be used to meet an energy industry target. Next slide, please. So who will set a FLAG target? Companies will be required to set a FLAG target if they meet one of these two conditions. The first one is if they have activities in the FLAG sectors listed here. So those are forest and paper products, food production, either from agricultural production or from animal source, food and beverage processing, food and staples retailing, and finally, tobacco. But they will also be required to set a FLAG target if they have FLAG-related emissions totaling 20% or more of the company's overall emissions across scopes 1, 2, and 3, regardless of the sector in which they operate. When companies fall below that 20% threshold, the SBTi will still recommend, but does not require, these companies to set a FLAG target. When companies fall into this category and they choose not to set a FLAG target, they must still account for FLAG-related emissions and include them in the energy industry target. Removals cannot be included in this case. Next slide, please. So, an important aspect of FLAG targets is that they are set in addition to a company's energy industry target. FLAG and energy industry targets are separate because companies cannot account for biogenic removals to meet their energy and industry targets. And as you can see here as well on the right side of your screen, there are two options for companies that will set FLAG targets. The FLAG sector pathway for companies in the demand side with diversified sources of emissions, and the FLAG commodity pathway for supply-side companies with a high percentage of their emissions emanating from one or several of those commodities. The commodity pathway includes 11 specific commodities, all with high carbon footprints. It also covers 26 specific regions and countries. Any commodity that is not included in the commodity pathway should be included in the sector pathway. Next slide, please. Let's now turn to land conversion. Land conversion is a particularly important aspect in the SBTi flag guidance. Stopping conversion of natural ecosystems is a key mitigation lever to achieve flag targets. Land conversion represents over 38% of the mitigation potential for the land sector. This is why it is fully covered in the flag sector pathway land use change modeling. The sector pathway includes all types of land conversion, and companies must include all emissions related to land use change in their inventory in alignment with the GHG Protocol land sector and removals guidance that was presented just previously by Matt Ramlo. It is important to note that it will be very difficult for a company to achieve its flag target without stopping conversion of natural ecosystems in its value chain. This is why no conversion and no peat burning commitments aligned with the Accountability Framework Initiative are strongly recommended in the SBTi flag guidance. Next slide, please. In addition to the land use change emissions that must be included in a company's inventory, FLAG requires a no deforestation commitment. This commitment must cover a company's entire value chain. This is mainly because deforestation accounts for 80% of land use change emissions. The no deforestation commitment must be set for December 31st, 2025 at the latest, and this requirement will remain the same for companies setting targets after the release of the final version of the GHG Protocol land sector and removals guidance expected in 2024. Companies are encouraged to prioritize stopping deforestation and conversion in their supply chains. Next slide, please. Now that we have finished this section on key features and requirements, let's look at a couple of frequently asked questions related to the topics that was just presented. The first one is, are emissions from wetland conversions and peat burning to be included in a flag target? So we touched upon this during the presentation. Yes, all emissions from land conversion must be included in a flag target. These emissions must be accounted for in line with the GHG Protocol land sector and removals guidance. Then we have another question. What is considered as working lands? Working lands are lands in a company's value chain that are productive. For instance, removals due to silvopasture would be considered as occurring on working lands. But removals from afforestation on lands that are outside of a company's supply chain would not count towards a flag target. Next slide, please. So we'll now start this next section. It will provide a very brief introduction to the flag target setting process. You may also listen to the webinar recording shining a light on the flag target setting process, an event that was held in English in March 2023 for more information. It's available in SBTi's YouTube channel. There are also several resources that are available to assist you during this process. First and most importantly, the SBTi flag guidance is the main resource which includes all the requirements and recommendations for flag target setting. Secondly, the Flag Getting Started Guide will help you understand the timelines, documents to submit, and the submission package that is the most appropriate to your company. The last 3 documents are required for flag target submission and will include the flag target setting tool to model your targets using the sector pathway, the commodity pathway, or a mix of both. The target submission form, where you will provide all the information related to your company's energy and industry emissions. And finally, the flag annex, where you will provide the information related to your company's flag emissions. If you are preparing to submit science-based targets for the first time, there are other resources that will help you and that go beyond the flag target setting process. They are also listed in this slide. Next slide, please. To finish on this section, we'll now have a brief look at the flag submission and data requests. When companies submit targets for validation, there are flag data requests in 2 SBTi submission documents that your company must take into account: the target submission form and the flag annex submission form. As you can see on this chart, all companies setting science-based targets must report flag data separately from energy and industry data. This applies regardless of whether companies set a flag target or not. However, this process is not exactly the same for these two cases. Companies not setting a flag target report flag gross emissions, that is without removals, in the target submission form, and include these emissions in the energy industry target. Companies setting a flag target must include land emissions and removals, in case they have some, in the separate flag target. And as mentioned before, companies setting flag targets must also commit to no deforestation, with a target year no later than 2025. These companies shall use the flag annex submission form to provide information on flag emissions per commodity and per region, and disaggregated data on flag emissions and removals per commodity. Next slide, please. So that was a very brief introduction to the flag target setting process. We'll now have a look at some frequently asked questions before moving on to the next section. The first question is, my company has previously validated science-based targets and has to include a flag target. Do we need to update our energy industry targets? Yes, to ensure that emissions have been properly separated between energy industry and flag targets, a near-term energy industry target update is required along with a flag target submission. The next one is how to set a target for a corporate with diverse areas of business ranging from steel production to farming and services. So companies in several sectors must use specific guidance for existing SBTi sectors. So for example, power sector, maritime sector, flag. For the other sectors, company may set 1.5 degree aligned targets using the cross-sector absolute pathway. Thank you everyone now for your attention, and I pass it back to Amélie.
Thanks, Lucine. And for the next section, we will be hearing from Teddy on a few case studies of companies setting flag targets. Over to you, Teddy.
Thank you, Emily, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. I see a lot of familiar names here, so really nice to see you. So to close out the webinar today, we will present you some of the case studies to going through some of the real examples of the validation of SBTi here. So next slide, please. Yeah, so in this section, I'll present you two hypothetical cases here. As you may see on the screen, to illustrate the flag target setting process of a company A and also company B here. So company A here is a large Chinese retail company that specializes in grocery items and also general merchandise here. This company operates in a flag designated sector, which is food and staples retailing, and also must set a flag target here. Company A also has already SPT approved. Therefore, company needs to proceed with the target recalculation with the flag target here. We also have another example, which is company B, which is a large palm oil company based in Indonesia. And company B will set a science-based target for the first time. So this company also operates in the flag designated sector, is yet in addition to the traditional energy and also industry target. So let's deep dive into the company A first. The next slide. So can you go to the next slide, Emily? Yeah, so this is the starting company A here, which has had an existing SBT target and also has to recalculate to include the flag target here. So let's highlight some of the key process and also the timeline aspect for the company here. So because the company has already SBT validated, they could recalculate it to include the flag target within 6 months of the release of the greenhouse gas protocol line sectoral guidance that are already being shared by Matt Ramlo in the previous section. But in this case, the company actually chose to not want not waiting and decide to recalculate the science-based target this year, we include FLAG using the draft of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Line Sector Renewables Guidance, which is now also available online here. And therefore, for the tool usage, the company A has FLAG emission associated with several commodities and land activities within supply chain. Therefore, the company uses the FLAG sector tool that appropriate for companies operating in the demand side here. Aside from that one, the company also need to update near-term energy industry targets and submit FLAG target at once. This is important, of course, to keep consistency with the FLAG criteria here. And next slide, we'll see about some of the documents that the company need to submit here. So there are 3 documents that the company must send to the SPTI. The first one is the tools that used to calculate the target. This is tools that you might be familiar with already. And then the second one is the near-term target update form here. So this is pretty different with the near-term target validation form that are already available. And the third one is the FLAG annex submission form here. For the tools that are used by company A to calculate FLAG targets and also industry energy targets are submitted along with the target submission form here. Company A used the specific FLAG tool to calculate the FLAG targets. And then the company uses the near-term target update form to provide information on its energy and industrial emission here. In this form also, the land emission are removed from the non-FLAG inventory, which means that there needs to be a separation between the FLAG emissions and also non-FLAG emissions. And lastly, the company A provided all the requested information related to land-based emission in the FLAG annex form here, the third document on your screen right now. And the company needs to ensure also that all of the information provided in the main submission is only related to energy industrial emission, and that all of the information provided in the FLAG annex is only related to FLAG emissions. Additionally, in this FLAG annex form, the company provides data disaggregated per commodity or per region, as mentioned by Lucine in the previous section. We have a breakdown between commodities and also between region, as well as to separate gross emissions and also renewables. And next slide, we'll have some of the sample of the inventory from company A here, which shows that the company A actually have the scope emission is scope 1, 2, and 3. As you can see here, the emissions are very concentrated in the company scope 3 here, and they are separated for a FLAG and also energy industrial targets. The company have 20 million tons of FLAG emissions in scope 3 and another 30 million tons of non-FLAG emissions in scope 3 here. So the portion of FLAG emissions actually related to purchase goods from company A, which is lie under this scope 3 category 1, are reflecting in the land intensity activities in the company's supply chain here. So the company A here needs to set a separate FLAG target for those emissions from scope 3 category 1. And next slide, I'll give you a brief update about the input data from the company also. Next slide again. Yeah, so this is the input data. As I mentioned before, company A uses the sector pathway to calculate the FLAG target for all of its land-based emission. And this is what the FLAG tool, FLAG sector is like here. So first thing first, the company needs to enter the base year here and the target year here, which is in the tab of in base and target year tab, and then the FLAG-based emissions in the FLAG sector tab here. And then the tool shows the target results, which is graphically and in form of tables. You can see that company A start with 20 million tons of FLAG emissions in 2019 and must reduce to no more than 15 million of and 100 tons of emissions in 2027 here. So this is actually already being shown in this screenshot. So having a total of abatement of 4,800,000 tons of CO2 emissions, which means a FLAG target of 24.2% emission reductions. So this is really helpful if you want to try out some of the data that already being established by your company. And the tools also show an estimate removals and emission reductions share in this abatement here, as you can see here in the screenshot here. And next slide, please. Yeah, this is just to give you a summary. As you can see here, the sector pathways forms a FLAG target for company A of 24% emission reductions, that including removals by 2027. And to communicate the target, Company A follows this language, which is Company A commits to reduce absolute scope 3 flag emissions by 24% by 2027 from a 2019 base year. And you put asterisk also that the targets also includes flag emissions and removals here. Yeah, that is the example from Company A. Let's see the Company B, which is a bit different because Company B is a large palm oil producer based in Indonesia, and they will set the SBTs for the first time here. So because they are setting the target for the first time, the company submits a flag target upon submission. And this company has flag emissions associated with palm oil production only, which is the company uses the flag commodity tool that includes specific pathways for palm oil here. And as mentioned previously in this presentation, flag targets are additional to non-flag target. Therefore, Company B submits not only flag target, but also near-term industry and energy targets. Next slide. We'll give you also an overview about the documents to submit. So the documents to submit by Company B are pretty much similar to the previous cases. So 3 types of the documents are, the first one is the tools used to calculate this target. The second one is the near-term target submission form, and then the third one is the flag annex submission form here. The only difference here is that compared to the Company A, the Company B needs to submit the near-term target submission form instead of the updated near-term target submission form because they are submitting their SBTs for the first time here. And next slide, we'll see the sample emission inventory. So as you may see here, the Company B actually has most of their emission in scope 1, which is including the company plants, grows, and process of oil palms to manufacture crude palm oils and also crude palm kernel oils. So the company has 0.1 million tons of flag emission in scope 1, which is generated actually from what you imagine, which is oil palm plantations, and a significant portion of the emissions here comes from land conversion here. Meanwhile, also the company has another 6,000 tons of non-flag emissions in scope 1 that are associated with energy use in the mills operated by the company to process, palm fruits to crude palm oil and kernel oil here. Aside from that one, the company also have flag emissions in scope 3. This includes mainly the land emissions generated from external resources, such as 25% of the company processes fruits come from land partners here. So this should be included in the scope 3. And same as Company A, Company B also set a separate flag target in addition to the energy intensity target. And the flag target for Company B includes all land-based emissions 1 and here. And let's see the input data. The next slide. Yeah, you may see the Company B uses the flag specific pathway for palm oil because this is operating in one specific pathways. That the data to be entered here differs slightly compared to the sector pathways shown in the previous examples of Company A here. First thing first, Company B needs to select the region or country first. For example, here you see that Indonesia region being selected. Then the company enters the base year and the target year in the base and target year tab. And then also the total production in tons of oil and the base year emission, which is in the palm oil commodity pathway tool tab. And when using the commodity pathways, company needs to enter data on land removals here. But we know that the data might not be available. If in case the appropriate data is not available, companies can enter removals as 0 here. In this case, in this example, Company B actually informed us that more than 400,000 tons of carbon removals are associated mainly with agroforestry implemented in some of their planted areas. So this is in line with what Luzin mentioned and can be included as the removals. And the regenerative practices adopted in those agroforestry systems resulted in the greater fertility of and soil carbon stocks that considerably higher than system. Therefore, they can account it for their land greenhouse gas inventory here. And of course, last but not least, the company also needs to inform expected production in the target year here. And next slide, we'll see the total target. Same as previous one, the tool will help you formulate the target. So the commodity pathways from FLAG target company or company B, and communicate again the target of company B follows this form. So yeah, there is the two interesting examples that hopefully can give you a bit more nuance on how actually the companies can set a FLAG target. And I will hand back over to Emily. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daddy. And we have come to the end of our webinar. Just a few more things to share with everybody. The SPTI has developed a series of resources, as mentioned earlier, listed on this slide. This is to help support companies in your FLAG target setting process. You can also access all these resources and additional ones in the SPTI's webpage as well. And during the course of this session, we've heard the key role of the forest, land, and agriculture sector has to play in accelerating the transformation to a net zero economy and really help avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. So companies in this sector now have the opportunity to be responsible and raise your ambition as indicated in the criteria that our experts have spoken through. Thank you for all the applause. It's really nice to see. If you have any further questions, please direct them to the emails listed on this page. And finally, I want to thank our colleagues from the SBTi and Greenhouse Gas Protocol who came on speakers today, and then also those who have working behind the scenes, including our live interpreters. And we encourage you to set your near-term and net zero science-based targets today to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change. So thank you very much. I wish you all the best.